Hi there. It could be argued that ignorance is the number one prerequisite for spirituality. After all, if you knew everything, then why would you seek a higher power? I mentioned in a previous video how I think that the Mashal, or the book of Proverbs from the Hebrew scriptures, is an extremely undervalued sacred meditative tradition that's basically hidden in plain sight and often misunderstood as simplistic two-dimensional dogma. In this video, I want to introduce the sayings of Agur, which you can find in Proverbs 30 in an English Bible. And in doing that, I'd also like to reflect a little bit on the nature of wisdom, ignorance, and spirituality, because I think those really are the kinds of things that Agur is reflecting on through his Mashalic tradition. The sayings of Agur begins with a number of longer sayings. Most of the book of Proverbs contains short sayings of 2 or 3 lines, but most of this section have slightly longer sayings, the first of which consists of verses 2 through 6, or you could say 2 to 4, depending how you divide it. It starts in some translations with, I am weary, God, but I can prevail. Though, depending how you divide the Hebrew words, this might actually just be part of the header, and if that's the case, then you would translate it, the oration to Ithiel and Ukal. So anyway, after that, that's when the saying proper begins. But it starts unexpectedly, because it starts with, surely I am only a brute, not a man. I do not have human understanding. I have not learned wisdom, nor have I attained to the knowledge of the Holy One. I think part of what makes Agur so profound is that the sayings don't begin with knowledge, but with ignorance. The sage doesn't begin by providing his credentials, but by negating his credentials entirely, with a poetic flair that suggests he has completely and wholeheartedly embraced his ignorance. And perhaps one could suggest that part of the point of the Mashal is that we may embrace our own ignorance as well, or at least at a minimum, we may become increasingly aware that we are free to embrace our own ignorance, our own brutishness, to use the NIV's colorful translation. We are free to sink down in our weariness and say, I know nothing. This particular saying has 2 more sections to it, which I'll get to in a minute, which build on his assertion of personal ignorance. But I think the role of his ignorance in this particular poem can be taken to suggest that ignorance is his starting place, almost like emptiness and subhuman ignorance are the birthplace he is proud to call his own. This is part of why I suggest that Agur might agree with the idea that ignorance is the number one prerequisite for spirituality. After all, who would seek a higher power if he wasn't trapped in a state of ignorance? Let me tell you a story from my own life to give you a bit of my own personal perspective that affects how I read this saying. Something like 10 years ago, I was working as a janitor at a high school. And during lunchtime, I was waiting for the kids to finish so I could finish sweeping the gym/cafeteria. And then there was this kind of unforgettable moment when I happened to see this very small 6th grader walking up to a 7th or 8th grader who pretty sure would have been at least a head taller, and said something or asked a question or something of the sort. And then since this was a high school, both of those kids were some of the littlest kids in the room. And the older kid began to explain something to the littler kid. And you could tell by the look on her face and by her nonverbals and stuff that she felt that she knew everything and she was giving all the answers about everything to this kid. And then by the look on the younger kid's face, these big eyes, awe and wonder, this big kid knows everything. And that image kind of stuck in my head for weeks, because from my own adult perspective, it was so bizarre. While I'm living my life working on my grad studies, trying to keep my head above water academically, there was my life, and then way over somewhere else, there were these 2 little kids with barely just a number of years separating them. And yet there was a palpable awe in the face of the one who was a little bit smaller. And I thought to myself, maybe this is all that there ever is. Maybe this is just what the world is made out of and has always been made out of. That was about 10 years ago, and I haven't changed my mind since then. I think that in that moment, I really did see the whole universe in one moment. And I think that Agur saw something very similar. It's like we as humans, we're all squeezed into this tiny plane, worshiping one another without realizing that it's an infant we're worshiping. And the difference in age between us, or the difference in knowledge, is only impressive because no human ever exceeds the furthest limitations that limit us. So the awe that we feel about sages and guides, whether Agur here, or the heads and founders of various religious or spiritual traditions, or the brilliant minds that direct PhD programs in prestigious universities. It's all kind of the same, I suppose. We're all tiny infants worshiping the intelligence of one another, and in some cases worshiping our own intelligence, as though the 8th grade is where all knowledge and understanding culminate, as though being just a little bigger and smarter than the next guy is equivalent to seeing the universe transparently. But of course, the world is a much weirder place than 8th graders would ever guess. And Agur seems to be so aware of this that he simply begins with, you need to know I'm not even at the human level. I don't have wisdom or knowledge. I'm in a state of ignorance. This is where we are. Here's a slightly different translation, and I'll keep reading past the transition point. The oration to Ithio and Ukal. I am more stupid than any other person. I lack a human's ability to understand. I have not gained wisdom. I have no knowledge of the Holy One. Who has gone up to heaven and come down? Who has gathered the wind in his hands? Who has bound up the waters in a cloak? Who has established all the ends of the earth? What is his name? What is the name of his son, if you know? If someone were to interpret the first portion as only applying to Agur's ignorance and not to the listener's ignorance, then the second portion of this Mashal definitely gets you away from that idea. It's not just Agur's self-effacing manner of speaking, let's say, or certainly not just Agur, getting down on himself or something. Far from that, it seems that this is also Agur's point. He lists 4 descriptions of the expansiveness of the universe, each of which are to some degree evocative of our inner sense of transcendence, and in most cultures of the world are often associated with the divine, such as with God or the gods. He begins with heaven or the sky, the up there, which is where we look when we pray, which also tends to represent either the realm of the divine or something like it in most cultures, and certainly in the Hebrew culture. And he queries, which of us has gone up into that divine realm and then returned, perhaps to provide answers about fate or the principles that govern the universe. Then after the sky, he lists the wind, which of us has gathered the wind, representing the mysterious currents that travel unseen between sky and land, which we can't control no matter how hard we try. And then thirdly, he lists the waters and asks about them, representing the mysterious currents that travel beneath ground level, beneath our level. So we're kind of getting the sense of the scope of everything around us, with the great expanse of the sky and the winds and the waters. We've got this poetic representation of everything around us but far beyond us. And then he finishes with, who has established all the ends of the earth, which we can relate to in a certain way. We can relate to the idea of establishing the ends or the extents of something. If we've ever built something that had some particular scope, for example, a house has its walls and its foundation, a good essay has its core ideas and its basic outline, a piece of music has its primary keys, key or keys, and then its most important melodic or its melodic and harmonic components. But which of us, he seems to be asking, which of us could map out the extent and design of the world like that? And then he finishes with, What is his name and the name of his son, if you know? Driving home the fact that even if we could identify someone who might meet the above criteria, we could never come close to having enough authority to determine his name. Instead, we stand so far below the sky and the heavens, subject to the changing tides of wind and water, cluelessly wedged into the framework of the world that we don't understand. And to think that someone in this context could call himself a sage or a great source of wisdom or knowledge. So Agur simply says, I don't know anything. Now, the next portion, verses 5 and 6, logically follows from the preceding, but it serves as such a transition that it could be suggested that it should be understood as the next Mashal, rather than the end of this one. In the next one, the next two verses, they abruptly turn the attention immediately from the reflection on ignorance toward a reflection on the sacred. The tone changes very quickly, and some translations place a division between verses 4 and 5, which makes very good literary sense to me, at least. While the meditation on ignorance prepares the way for the meditation on the sacred that follows, I think there's intended to be a pause between the two, a breathing moment where you lay down the scroll, lift your face upward, and feel the air around you, the universe in which you exist, and simply let the words continue as they always will. The words that say, I cannot see from the unseen realm. I cannot see from the unseen realm. I cannot see from the unseen realm. So anyway, really good stuff here in the beginning of the sayings of Agur. Next up in this series, I'll continue my discussion as I move on to verses 5 and 6. So maybe I'll see you then.